The Silent Village. Chapter 1. A wrong turn. The countryside road was shrouded in fog, a dense, swirling mist that clung to the ground and turned the world into a ghostly grey. Rebecca stared out of the passenger side window, tapping her finger nervously against the dashboard as the car's headlights struggled to pierce through the murk. "This is the third time we've passed that tree," she said, her voice tight. She gestured to a gnarled oak with a distinctive split trunk that loomed like a figure in the mist. Her husband, Michael, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. "It's not the same tree," he muttered. "I know where I'm going." Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Clearly you don't. We should have stayed on the main road." "Trust me, this shortcut will save us at least half an hour. The sat-nav just needs a signal," Michael replied, holding up his phone with a grimace, as it displayed a mocking "no service" icon. Their weekend getaway had started as a romantic escape to a cosy inn in the Cotswolds. They'd been planning it for weeks, desperate for a break from their suffocating city life, but the bickering that had begun with packing their bags had only worsened with every mile. And now, as the fog thickened and the tension grew, Rebecca wondered if this trip had been a mistake. "Maybe we should just turn back," she suggested, her tone softening. Michael sighed, glancing at her for a brief moment before focusing back on the road. "We'll find the turn-off soon, I promise." But the turn-off never came. Instead, the road narrowed, the asphalt giving way to uneven gravel that crunched beneath the tyres. The fog seemed thicker here, the trees closer together, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. Rebecca shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. "Michael, this doesn't feel right," she said. "We're in the middle of nowhere." "I know," he replied, slowing the car to a crawl. "But we can't just stop. There's got to be something up ahead." As if on cue, the faint glow of light appeared in the distance. It was faint and flickering, but unmistakable. A warm, amber radiance cutting through the cold grey haze. "See?" Michael said, relief in his voice. "There's a village or something. We can ask for directions." Rebecca hesitated, her stomach knotting with unease. "It's so remote. Why would there be a village out here?" "People live in the countryside, Rebecca," Michael said with a forced chuckle. "Not everything has to make sense." The car rolled forward, and soon the source of the light came into view. Lanterns hung from wooden posts along a cobblestone street that seemed untouched by time. Small cottages with steeply pitched roofs lined the narrow lane, their windows glowing softly. The architecture was old, medieval perhaps, with weathered stone walls and ivy creeping up the sides. Yet something about it felt wrong. Rebecca noticed the symbols first. Carved into the wooden door frames of every house were intricate markings, loops and jagged lines that seemed almost alive in the flickering light. She couldn't look away from them, her eyes tracing the strange shapes as a chill ran down her spine. "Michael, do you see those carvings?" she asked, her voice hushed. He nodded, but his expression was unreadable. "Probably some kind of tradition. These old villages are full of superstitions." As they rolled further into the village, they saw no one, just the soft glow of lanterns and the oppressive silence that pressed against them like a weight. Michael pulled the car to a stop in what appeared to be the village square, where a large stone well sat at the centre. "I'll go knock on a door," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. Rebecca grabbed his arm. "Wait, it's too quiet. Where is everyone?" Before he could answer, a door creaked open. An elderly woman stepped out, her face pale and drawn, her eyes sunken. She wore a dark shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and she glanced at them briefly before raising a single finger to her lips in a shushing gesture. Rebecca frowned, her unease deepening. "Why is she shushing us?" Michael waved it off. "Probably just doesn't want us waking the whole village. Stay here. I'll go talk to her." As he approached the woman, Rebecca stayed in the car, her hands gripping her coat tightly. She watched as Michael gestured and spoke, his voice low. The woman didn't respond, just kept her finger pressed to her lips. Finally, she pointed down the lane, toward a larger building at the far end of the village. Michael returned to the car, his expression strained. "She says there's an inn we can stay at for the night," he said. "Did she say anything else?" Rebecca asked. Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not really. She's probably just shy, or doesn't speak much English." Rebecca didn't believe him. There was something he wasn't telling her, something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. "Michael, I don't think we should stay here," she said. "Where else can we go? We're stuck, Rebecca. Let's just get some rest and sort it out in the morning." Against her better judgment, she relented. They drove down the lane towards the inn, its sign swinging gently in the foggy breeze. The building was larger than the others, with a timber-framed facade and windows that glowed faintly. Yet it, too, bore the strange carvings on its doorframe. As they stepped inside, the oppressive silence seemed to follow them. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. A man stood behind the counter, his face as pale and drawn as the woman's. He too raised a finger to his lips in that same unnerving gesture. Rebecca's stomach churned, her instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. The innkeeper was unlike anyone Rebecca had ever met. His face was pale and lined with age, yet his piercing eyes and smooth, youthful complexion made him look eerily timeless. His hair was white but full, combed neatly back, and his clothes were pristine, a dark suit that seemed out of place for someone running a remote village inn. He greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice soft and deliberate. "We don't get many visitors here, especially at this hour. How fortunate for us to have you." Michael cleared his throat, holding out the car keys awkwardly. "Thanks, we were just passing through. Got a bit lost in the fog. We'll head out in the morning, once it clears." The innkeeper's smile widened. "Of course, the fog can be troublesome here. You'll find it has a way of keeping people close." Rebecca shifted uneasily, gripping Michael's arm. She didn't like the way the man was looking at them, too focused, as though he was studying every detail of their faces. "You must be tired after your journey," the man continued. "I'll have my wife bring tea to your room. You'll feel much better after a rest." Rebecca opened her mouth to protest, but Michael spoke first. "That sounds great. Thank you." The innkeeper handed Michael an old iron key, the metal cold and heavy. "Room 3, at the top of the stairs," he said. "Make yourselves comfortable, and if you need anything, just call." The way he said call sent a shiver down Rebecca's spine, as though he knew they wouldn't dare. The staircase creaked as they climbed to their room, the walls lined with faded portraits of stern-looking figures. Rebecca noticed that some of the faces in the paintings bore an uncanny resemblance to the innkeeper, though the clothes and hairstyles were centuries out of date. When they reached room 3, Michael unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking on the dim light. The room was sparse but clean, with a single bed, a wooden wardrobe, and a small table by the window. On the nightstand was another carving, similar to the ones they'd seen on the door frames outside, a symbol etched into dark wood, its loops and jagged lines making Rebecca's stomach churn. Michael flopped onto the bed with a sigh. "See? It's not so bad. Just one night, and we'll be on our way." Rebecca didn't respond. She stood by the window, staring out into the fog-shrouded village below. The lanterns cast flickering shadows, and she could have sworn she saw movement, figures shifting between the buildings, just out of sight. "I don't like this place, Michael," she said finally, turning to face him. "Something's off. The people, the carvings. It doesn't feel right." Michael sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's a bit weird, but it's just an old village. You're overthinking it." "No, I'm not," she snapped. "That man, the way he looked at us, didn't it bother you? It's like he was sizing us up." Michael sighed. "You're tired, Rebecca. Once the fog lifts, we'll leave, I promise. But for now, let's just rest." Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, but a sudden knock at the door made her jump. Michael frowned and got up to answer it. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was the innkeeper, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. Beside him stood a woman, her face pale and angular, her long grey hair tied back in a severe braid. She wore a simple dress, but her eyes were sharp and unsettling, darting past Michael to settle on Rebecca. "Forgive the intrusion," the innkeeper said, his tone as polite as ever, "but I thought I might assist your husband with directions. There's a map in the back office that may be helpful." Michael hesitated, glancing back at Rebecca. She shook her head, her unease growing, but Michael seemed oblivious. "Sure, that'd be great," he said, stepping into the hallway. The innkeeper's wife slipped past him into the room, her presence instantly filling the small space. She moved slowly, her pale hands clasped in front of her, her gaze fixed on Rebecca. Michael looked back one last time, mouthing, "I'll be right back," before disappearing down the hallway with the innkeeper. Rebecca turned to the woman, who was now studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Can I help you?" Rebecca asked, her voice shaky. The woman smiled faintly. "No, dear. I was just curious. You're younger than I expected." Rebecca frowned. "Expected? What do you mean?" The woman tilted her head, as if considering her answer. "Your parents, are they still alive?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. "What?" "Yes, of course they are. Why?" "And your health?" The woman continued, ignoring the question. "Any illnesses? Weaknesses? You look strong, but sometimes looks can be deceiving." Rebecca backed up, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What are you talking about?" The woman's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, nothing to worry about, dear. You'll do just fine." Before Rebecca could respond, the woman turned and glided toward the door, her movements eerily smooth. She paused in the doorway, glancing back with a look that was equal parts pity and satisfaction. "Good night," she said softly, then closed the door behind her. Rebecca stood frozen, her heart pounding. Whatever was happening in this village, she knew one thing for certain. They needed to leave, and soon. Michael returned to the room, looking irritated but relieved. He tossed the iron key onto the table and exhaled deeply. "I got it all figured out," he said, his tone reassuring. "We just made a wrong turn. The map in the office was clear. It's just a matter of waiting for the fog to lift." Rebecca's eyes were wide, her hands trembling as she grabbed his arm. "Michael, something is wrong here. The innkeeper's wife. She came in after you left. She was strange. She kept asking about my parents, my health. Then she said, 'You'll do just fine.' What does that even mean?" Michael frowned, brushing her concerns aside with the wave of his hand. "It doesn't mean anything. She's probably just some eccentric old woman. These rural villages are full of quirky people." Rebecca shook her head, her voice rising. "No, Michael. This isn't just quirky. It's wrong. I feel it. We need to leave now." Michael sighed. sitting on the edge of the bed. "We will, as soon as the fog lifts. Trust me, Rebecca. I know the way back now. We'll be fine." Rebecca turned to the window, frustration bubbling into fear. She peered out into the dense fog that swallowed the village, the flickering lanterns barely visible through the swirling mist. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a shadow moving between the cottages. "There are people out there," she whispered, leaning closer to the glass, "walking in and out of the fog." Michael joined her at the window, squinting into the haze. "I don't see anything," he said, but Rebecca's heart was pounding. Suddenly, a sharp crash shattered the tense silence. The sound of glass breaking reverberated through the room. "What the hell?" Michael exclaimed, rushing to the window. He looked down to see the front passenger side window of their car had been smashed, shards of glass glittering on the cobblestone. A stone lay on the ground beside the car, its edges sharp and menacing. "Stay here," Michael growled, grabbing his coat. "Michael, no," Rebecca pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Don't go out there, please." "I'm not letting some idiot vandalize our car and get away with it," Michael snapped, pulling free of her grip. "I'll be right back. Just lock the door behind me." Rebecca watched in horror as Michael disappeared into the fog, his silhouette swallowed by the thick mist. She pressed her face against the window, straining to see him, but all she could make out were faint, shifting shadows. Then she heard it. A scream, Michael's scream, sharp and agonized, cutting through the oppressive silence. "Michael!" she cried, wrenching the door open, but before she could take a step, the innkeeper appeared in the doorway. He stood there, his expression calm, but his eyes glittering with something dark. Behind him, the fog seemed to swirl unnaturally, as if alive. "We've been waiting for you, Rebecca," he said softly, stepping into the room. "It's been a long time since we've had a new family member in this village." Rebecca stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What are you talking about? Where's Michael? What have you done to him?" The man smiled, a cold, eerie smile. "You'll see soon enough." Before she could scream, before she could run, the room spun violently and everything went black. Rebecca awoke to the hum of the car engine and the familiar sight of the road ahead. The fog was gone, replaced by the soft light of dawn streaming through the windshield. Michael was beside her, both hands on the steering wheel, whistling a tune as if nothing had happened. She blinked, disoriented, her head pounding. "Michael?" He glanced at her, concerned. "Hey, you're awake. You okay? You've been out for a while." Rebecca touched her temple, struggling to remember. I had a bad dream," she murmured, "but I can't remember it. It felt so real." Michael chuckled. "Probably too much stress from the city. Don't worry, we're here." Rebecca looked out the window, her heart sinking with unease. They were pulling into the quaint little inn they'd been heading for originally, a picturesque stone building surrounded by rolling green hills. Everything looked perfect, exactly as she'd imagined. But as they parked the car and Michael got out to grab their bags, Rebecca hesitated. Her gaze drifted to the windshield, where a faint smear of dirt had formed an all-too-familiar symbol, the looping, jagged carving she'd seen on the doorframes of the village. Her pulse quickened, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. "Rebecca!" Michael called from outside, his voice cheerful. "You come in." She forced a smile, shaking her head to clear the growing sense of dread. "Come in," she replied, stepping out of the car. But as she followed him towards the inn, the symbol lingered in her mind, and deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Back home, life seemed to slip back into its usual rhythm. Michael returned to work, and Rebecca spent her days catching up on projects and enjoying the quiet of their flat. The strange dream, or whatever it had been, faded into a distant memory, like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Occasionally, Rebecca would feel a fleeting unease, a sense of being watched, but she dismissed it as residual nerves from their odd trip. Weeks passed, and one crisp autumn evening, Rebecca called Michael into the kitchen. She was glowing, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her hands trembling as she held a small white stick. "Michael," she said, barely able to contain herself. "I'm pregnant." Michael's face lit up, his initial shock quickly replaced with pure joy. He pulled her into his arms, laughing, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "This is amazing. We're going to be parents." The weeks that followed were filled with happiness. They decorated the spare room, turning it into a nursery with soft pastel walls and whimsical animal decals. They pored over baby books, debated names, and attended their first ultrasound appointment. Michael couldn't stop grinning when he saw the tiny heartbeat on the screen, and Rebecca seemed happier than she'd been in years. But as the months passed, Rebecca began to change. It started subtly, a growing reluctance to be around other people. She became wary of friends and family who wanted to touch her belly or even sit too close. Her mood darkened whenever anyone suggested a baby shower, and she began avoiding public places altogether. "Rebecca," Michael said one evening as they sat on the couch, "don't you think you're being a little, overprotective? Everyone's just excited. They love you. They love the baby." Rebecca shook her head sharply. "No one must touch me, Michael. No one. It's not safe." "Not safe?" Michael frowned. "What do you mean? Safe from what?" She didn't answer, just stared at the flickering television with a distant expression, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Her eating habits changed next. The healthy, balanced meals she'd once enjoyed were replaced with an insatiable craving for meat, rare, bloody meat. She refused vegetables, bread, even fruit. When Michael tried to talk to her about it, she became defensive, accusing him of trying to harm the baby. "Rebecca, you can't just eat steak every night," he said, exasperated. "It's not healthy." Her eyes narrowed, her voice low and icy. "Don't tell me what I can and can't eat. I know what the baby needs." Michael began to worry. Her once gentle demeanour had become cold and hostile, and the connection they'd shared was slipping away. She barely let him touch her, recoiling from his hand as if his touch burned. "Rebecca, what's happening to you?" he asked one night, his voice breaking. But she didn't respond. She was staring out the window, her face pale, her lips trembling. "It's them," she whispered. Michael froze. "What do you mean?" "I see them," she said, her voice distant. "The innkeeper, his wife, the village. They're in my dreams. They're watching, waiting." Michael's stomach twisted. He hadn't thought about the village in weeks. It had seemed so surreal, almost like a figment of their imagination. But now, hearing her talk about it, the memories came flooding back. The fog, the strange carvings, the oppressive silence. "Rebecca, it was just a weird night, a strange place. It's not real." "It's real," she said, her eyes snapping to his. "I know it is. I feel it. Every night I see their faces. I hear their voices. They're telling me to protect the baby." Michael's throat tightened. "Maybe we can find the village again," he suggested, trying to calm her. "Look it up online. See if anyone else knows about it." They spent hours on Google Maps, scanning the countryside where they'd driven. Michael traced every road they'd taken, searching for any sign of the village, the inn, or even the cobblestone square with its stone well. There was nothing. "No," Rebecca muttered, her hand shaking as she clicked through the map. "It's supposed to be here. I know it's here." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "Rebecca, maybe it's better to just let it go." She shrugged him off, her breathing shallow. "I can't let it go, Michael. Don't you understand? They did something to us. To me." Michael tried to comfort her, but her words lingered in his mind long after she'd gone to bed. As much as he tried to rationalize their experience, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved, that their brief stay in the village had left a mark on them both. Rebecca's dreams grew worse. She woke in the middle of the night, gasping and clutching her stomach, her face pale and slick with sweat. When Michael asked what she'd seen, she refused to answer, her eyes hollow and haunted. One night, as she stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, Michael approached her carefully. "What do you see out there?" he asked. Rebecca didn't turn. "Figures," she said softly. "Shadowy figures, moving through the trees, watching." Michael glanced out the window, but all he saw was their quiet suburban street. Still, a chill crept over him, and for the first time he wondered if Rebecca was right. Maybe the village was real, and maybe they hadn't truly left it behind. The days leading up to Rebecca's due date were a nightmare for Michael. Her paranoia had grown to unbearable levels, her once loving demeanour replaced by an icy detachment that chilled him to the core. She spoke less to him, choosing instead to stare out of the window for hours, watching something he couldn't see. One night, as they sat in silence, Michael tried again to reach her. "Rebecca, the baby's due any day now. Let me help you. I want to be here for you." Her head snapped toward him, her eyes sharp and distant. "I don't need your help." Michael clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Rebecca, you're shutting me out. I'm your husband, the father of this baby. Don't you see what this is doing to us?" Rebecca's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, but then her expression hardened again. "You don't understand, Michael. You never will. They're coming." Michael's stomach twisted. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice low. Rebecca turned back to the window, her voice barely a whisper. "For the baby." Michael walked to the window, standing beside her. Outside, a thick, unnatural fog was rolling in, its tendrils creeping over the street like ghostly fingers. Shapes moved within it, shadowy figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "What the hell is that?" Michael whispered, his heart pounding. A sudden knock at the door made them both jump. Michael's breath quickened. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter. Rebecca turned to him, her face unreadable. "You won't stop them?" she said coldly. Then, almost mockingly, she added, "Your baby?" Michael ignored her, his grip tightening on the knife as he approached the door. He opened it, ready to confront whoever was outside. Standing there, framed by the swirling fog, was the strange man from the village. He looked exactly as Michael remembered, pale, ageless, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "I've come for my son," the man said calmly. Michael barely had time to react before pain exploded at the back of his head. The world tilted, his vision blurred, and he collapsed to the floor. Michael woke hours later, his head throbbing and blood trickling down his temple. He stumbled to his feet, calling out for Rebecca, but the house was silent. "No," he whispered, panic setting in. "No, no, no." He raced to the window, but the fog was gone, the street empty. Rebecca was nowhere to be found. Memories began to flood back. Fragments of the village, the inn, the carvings, the strange man, the smashed car window, someone hitting him over the head. Fueled by desperation, Michael grabbed his car keys and sped off, heading toward the countryside. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but some part of him, part that remembered the unnatural fog and the shadowy figures, guided him. The drive was a blur, the fog thickening the closer he got. Then, just as he thought he'd gone mad, the village appeared, emerging from the mist like a ghostly mirage. Michael slammed the car to a stop and ran toward the inn. The cobblestone square, the lanterns, the carvings, they were all just as he remembered. But the village was eerily silent, devoid of the strange people who had once stared at him with knowing eyes. He burst into the inn, his voice raw with panic. "Rebecca, where are you?" The building was empty, the air heavy with the scent of decay. He climbed the creaking stairs to the room where they'd stayed, throwing the door open. There, on the bed, was Rebecca. Her lifeless body lay sprawled on the blood-soaked sheets, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Her skin was pale, her hands limp at her sides. The evidence of childbirth was all around her, but the baby was gone. "No," Michael whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. "No, no, no." A sound broke through his sobs, a faint cry, high-pitched and echoing through the inn. Michael's head snapped up, and he bolted downstairs, following the sound to the main hall. There, standing in the centre of the room, were the strange man and his wife. The woman cradled something in her arms, swaying gently as the crying grew louder. The man smiled, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "It's been so long since we've had a new addition to the family," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Michael's heart raced. "That's my child," he snarled, stepping forward. "Rebecca's child." The woman turned to him, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "Is it, really?" she said softly. She held out the bundle toward him, and Michael reached for it, trembling. As the cloth fell away, his stomach turned. It wasn't a baby. The creature in her arms was small and twisted, its skin dark and leathery, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Tiny claws curled at its sides, and its mouth opened in a wail that sounded like a mix of a baby's cry and an animal's growl. Michael screamed, the sound raw and primal, echoing through the inn. The man's laughter filled the air as the scene dissolved into chaos. The fog crept into the room, swallowing everything in its path. From outside, the inn was barely visible through the dense mist. Michael's scream cut off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. As the sun rose and the fog began to lift, the village disappeared with it, leaving behind nothing but an empty expanse of countryside, and the village would remain hidden, forgotten by the world, until a new family member was needed.